Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Tiffany, a retired librarian turned homeschool mom, and in this video I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to look at a book that's not strictly a children's book, but is kind of important in the big scheme of teaching. This is a book that I wouldn't recommend for anyone probably younger than high schoolish. If your kid's a really good reader and is reading like adult biographies, they might find this book be able to read this book, but probably not younger than middle school, and they'd have to be a really good reader. So I'm going to be looking at the book Hidden Figures. This is the adult book. I did one for the picture book, and I did a few other books on Katherine Johnson. At this point, I'm probably going to cover more of the children's books on some of the other characters mentioned in this larger piece. But as of right now, I've just kind of covered the smaller books. This is the original nonfiction book, Hidden Figures by Margot Lee, which covers a big range of history. It starts back with not NASA, but rather with the National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics, the NACA, which was NASA's precursor. And it starts back during World War II. And then it goes up, and its epilogue ends in like 1970. So it goes from like around 1940-ish to 1970. It not only covers the lives mostly of three women, which would be Dorothy Vaughan, Katherine Johnson, and I can never remember her name, Mary Winston Jackson. So those are the three main women it covers. It later talks about, and this is near the end, a younger woman who is connected, who comes later. She doesn't come to NASA until the late 1960s, and that would be Dr. Kristen Mann Darden. So she was kind of the next generation. She was actually friends with Vaughn's eldest daughter. So she comes in much later. But it also covers the movement of the civil rights movement and the advancement of aeronautics. The changing from the National Committee for Aeronautics to NASA, and all the space history and the beginnings of the space program up until when they're landing on the moon. And it's a lot. So it's a very long, very detailed book, and really does go into the atmosphere that was going on in Langley, Virginia, which is where Shetterly grew up. She grew up in Hampton, Virginia, around the area of Newport News, which was the town that basically was developed around the Langley Labs back in the 40s, when they started studying space flight and flight in general. Because if you remember, World War I is when they really started using airplanes, and World War II is really where things took off. So the Air Force didn't exist, really, I don't think, until after World War II. So this covers that beginning era of airplanes and space flight and the space program, and it talks about all of this, and all focused primarily on the Langley Labs and the atmosphere, particularly around these female computers, which is what they were called. They were back then, before the dawn of computers, because again, that's what else this is covering. It's covering the creation of these huge room-sized computers and these computer languages. Before that, computers were people. That was essentially what Dorothy Vaughan, when she started, was considered. She was a computer. That's what they consider them. That's what both Katherine Johnson and Mary Winston Jackson were originally. That was their original titles. They were human computers. They did all the mathematical calculations. In fact, in the beginning of Langley Labs, there were two sets. There was the West End, or the black computers. Those were the black women. And then the East End, who were the white computers. So they were on completely different sides of the Langley Labs. The campus is what they called it. And that's what they did. They did all the mathematical calculations. So that was their job. They were human computers, or essentially calculators. And they used old machines, or not old machines, but then calculation machines, which oddly enough, there's a story, and I'll cover it later when it comes to our later person, Dr. Kirsten Mann Darden. Dr. Kirsten Mann Darden. Mann was her maiden name. How she started out working with some of these old machines, kind of doing that job before she realized, wait a minute, I need to speak up for myself and get myself moved into other things. But I will cover her. She's very much covered at the very end. In fact, most of her stories in the epilogue. But let's kind of go over where this book starts. And this is a fantastic book. It starts with the author talking about how she came up with the idea for this. She grew up knowing these women, and she had no clue. In the beginning, she was home visiting with her husband, visiting her parents, and somehow in conversation when they were in the car, he happened to bring up Dorothy Vaughan and kind of what she did. And this, I believe, Dorothy Vaughan had been her Sunday school teacher. She's like, what? She did what? And it came into her looking into these women and realizing their major contributions to the space program and aeronautics in general, and wanting to kind of bring these women to light and show the world, wait a minute, we have these amazing women in mathematics and science, these women of color who were vital to our mission to the moon and learning how rockets work and getting a man into space, and then getting men landing on the moon, and most importantly, getting them home again. So that's how the title came about. Why it's called Hidden Figures is because she herself, a woman of color, growing up around these women, never knew, because they never really talked about it. They did their jobs. They loved their jobs. They were very, very, very smart women. I mean, I covered some of the children's book on Katherine Johnson, even Dorothy Vaughan. These were women who graduated high school at 16 and were massively intelligent, very, very good at math. In fact, that's in the picture book, and that's one of the refrains. It's like they were very, very good at math, and they were amazing, and she wanted to bring them to light. So she came to study and tell their stories. So this book, it starts off with, and literally the first 10 chapters talk about, almost exclusively, about the life of Dorothy Vaughan, who was living in Farmville, Virginia, I believe is where it was, with her husband's family and her children. Her husband worked this hotel circuit, so he was basically the holidays when people would go on vacation and different places, and that's what he did. So she was teaching, and then she was, if I remember the book correctly, she was looking, I think, in the post office where they were posting job postings, and there was postings to basically work on the military base in the laundry room over the summer, or to be at computers at Langley. And she applied for both because she was teaching. She needed a summer job to earn money, and she got hired as a computer, and first moved herself temporarily to Newport News, West Virginia. And once she realized that this was going to be a permanent job, even after the war ended, she moved her children there, and then had 2 more. And then I think her and her husband ended up divorced just because they weren't seeing each other. He was still doing the hotel circuit primarily. In his times off, he was visit his family in Farmville, and she had a career. And she was at Langley in those labs until, I don't think she retired in the 80s. So from literally the 1940s until the 1980s. So this was very much her home. So the first 10 chapters really do cover Vaughan, how she starts there, her life, and her training, and her being, and kind of the early days of the computers there. One of the stories that I think I find really funny is because the black computers were really the only professional women on the campus, so they were the only ones who ate in the cafeteria. And because of segregation, again, this is still the 1940s, there was a special table for them, and he was labeled. And one of the women would kept stealing the sign until they finally gave up. And I think that I found that very, very funny. It's like, yep, she's just, and eventually just kind of disappeared. It's like they were probably going to sit together anyway, but they didn't want to have a specialized table just for the colored women. But there are a lot of little stories like that, and that those first really 10 chapters cover the environment of Langley and how even though these women were computers, a lot of the men, they weren't thinking about that. They were busy trying to first win a war, so they were paying attention to the science. So these women knew the numbers, and that's mostly all they cared about. So once you get through that part and essentially you get through the stories of how Vaughan ended up as a supervisor, which, more correctly, one of the supervisors essentially went crazy. She just, whether she became mentally ill or something happened, she essentially went crazy and was sent to, she was taken away and ended up dying a couple of years later in some sort of sanatorium. And Vaughan was put in the position as the supervisor. It took her a couple of years, I believe 2 years before they actually officially promoted her and gave her the raise that she was earned. But prior to that, she was doing the job. She was in charge. And essentially, she got stuck. There's a quote I think in the book by Katherine Johnson, that Vaughan was the smartest of them all. And she kind of got stuck until they closed ended the West End computing pool. And her and the rest of the women were dispersed throughout the lab. So that's covered later. Once we kind of get through the war years, she kind of jumps into the story of Mary Winston Johnson, who arrived in Langley in 1951. And it kind of follows her career, how she ended up in the supersonic pressure tunnels. Now, this is kind of a funny story, and the film Hidden Figures gets this wrong. They turned this into a subplot with Katherine Johnson. The real story of what happened is Mary Jackson was sent to work on the East End, and eventually everything is going fine. She needs to go to the bathroom. There's no black bathrooms there, and she's kind of humiliated by the white computers there. So she's pissed off, goes back to the west side. I don't know whether she'd gone to the bathroom. She must have gone to the bathroom. She comes out. She runs into, I'm going to butcher his name here. Kazmarazi Chesniak. Probably butchering that. They called him Kaz. He was an assistant section head in charge of one of the pressure wind tunnels. And now, from what I was able to read in the book, explains this, that African Americans, particularly at the time, put on a mask in front of whites. They don't show their true selves, which makes sense. I mean, there was a lot of issues going on. For some reason that day, Mary Jackson was just really pissed off, and that kind of fell away, and she complained to him about what had happened. And his simple answer was, why don't you come work for me? And that's literally how the book says it. It's like, he's like, why don't you come work for me? And that's what she does. She ends up working in these supersonic wind tunnels. And the other big story with her is she actually petitions the city of Hampton, Virginia, which is the outlying area, to take higher level math classes that were being offered at night at the whites only high school, so she could become a female engineer. And that's what she does. She gets permission to take these night classes with the men and becomes the first African American woman engineer to work at the laboratory. I don't believe it was NASA at the time, so she was still working for the National Aeronautics Committee. So that's the big story with her. So that you have a couple chapters covering her. Then it jumps to focuses on Kasper Johnson. So she arrives at Langley in 1952 as Catherine Global. She's still married. Her husband, she'd been teaching. I believe she'd been teaching there in Newport News. So, but her husband ends up dying, I think, of an aneurysm, a heart attack, something like that. So she And she goes on, and she's a single mother of 2 little girls at the time, and she starts as a human computer. Well, she's there for maybe a couple of days before they request, or she's sent by Vaughan to the Flight Research Division. They're requesting a computer. And there she stays for the next 5 months, working on them. Before Vaughan, now irritated, she basically, her probationary period is up, and it's like she marches to the head supervisor of that area, who's a typical white, very arrogant man whose women are in their place kind of thing, and essentially tells him off. It's like, you either need to give me my computer back, or you need to promote her and give her the raise. And there was a white computer who had been sent over around the same time, and it was the end of her probationary period too. And Vaughan advocated for her as well. It's like, you need to do this, and he did. He knew the rules. It's like, you know what you have to do. You need to do it, or you need to give me my computer back. So that, I found that as a very interesting story. I mean, this was an African-American woman in the 50s going up against this section head, this white male section head, and saying, yeah, you need to do your job. And she had the balls to do it. She was, once again, as I said, there was a quote there by Katherine Johnson that Dorothy was the smartest of all of them. So, and she had to be. I don't know if she was a single mother at this point, but she was mostly a single mother. She was raising her kids on her own. And she was probably being very much a mentor to a lot of the computers that were coming in, because she'd been there probably the longest at that time. So, but this covers, you get into Katherine Johnson's story, which is probably one of the most known. And it covers her career a little bit, going into the space program. The other big story with Johnson had to do with John Glenn. You know, a lot of people know who John Glenn is. He was one of the first astronauts. I think he got them to send him back into space as an old man. But he didn't trust the coordinates that the computer was spitting out for he was the first man to go into space and go orbit the Earth. He said he wanted Katherine Johnson to check those numbers. He wanted her to double check his trajectory, which basically is where you go up, where you come back down. And because at the time, if people remember the early parts of the space program, the space shuttle didn't exist. There was no landing. It was, you're in a rocket capsule and it's dropping into the ocean. So finding them, where the heck you're landing in the Atlantic Ocean, big deal. So he insisted that Katherine Johnson check the numbers. I believe it's quoted as he's saying, basically, get the girl to check the numbers and I'm good to go. So she double checked the computer for him and confirmed this is where he's taking off. This is where he's going to land, with all the variables, including weather and timing and ocean currents, possibly a lot of variables going in so they could find him and get him out of the ocean when he came back. So he trusted her with his life. And again, this is the 1950s, and this was a white man trusting a black female computer with his life. So I find that's probably pretty amazing. So the book goes on. It jumps into a bunch of stuff. Again, this book is very, very complex, and I'm very much skimming and generalizing it, because it goes into the personal lives of these women, their families, Katherine Johnson getting remarried, Dorothy Vaughan getting divorced and raising her children. I believe it goes into a bit of Mary Jackson and her career, and along with NASA and the changing times. And it's very, very complex. I did not read it word for word. I'm dyslexic, and I have a kid. So I kind of did a lot of skimming. I still enjoy the book, but I got through kind of the gist of it, and I read through it twice. So, fantastic book. Now, then you get into nearly the end of the books. So you get into around chapter 20 when you first meet Kristen Mann, who later becomes Dr. Kristen Mann Darden. She's about 18 at this point. She's friends with, I believe, Vaughan's daughter, and she meets Katherine Johnson, I believe, at a sorority when she's in college. So she's connected with Johnson's college sorority. She's actually a double major. She majors both in her science classes, and her father kind of pushed her as a backup to take education classes. So this is in the early 60s. She comes again when she starts at NASA in 1967. The first interaction she has with Johnson are at church. And Katherine Johnson introduces herself, and she's like, I know, I remember you. We met a long time ago. So, and you get a little bit of the epilogue with her career, because she is the next generation, and how Johnson very much becomes friends with her, and it's encouraging her, because this is the next generation. She ends up becoming an expert in sonic booms. And the story with her, which is, again, I believe this is in the epilogue, where she's working basically almost as a human computer in one of these minor labs, doing similar stuff to what Johnson and Jackson and Vaughan did early on, working on similar machines. And she overhears that she might be laid off because, and a male, I believe it was an African-American male, was being moved on. And she goes not to her boss, but to her boss's boss, someone else who had been, I think, confronted by Jackson years before about getting her into those math classes. And she asked, like, why am I still here and not moved on? And he said, this is just kind of the way things work. And he did, in fact, move her. He proceeded, this is her boss's boss, move her into a separate section, and she became an expert in those sonic booms, designing a computer program. Now, the other thing the story goes into, this is intermixed with things, is how Vaughan, realizing when the physical computers started showing up, and the East computers were being disbanded, that she needed to do something, particularly to keep her job and to keep her girls' job. So they learned the computer language. So they learned how to make those computers work. So she taught both herself and these other women the computer languages, so they could keep jobs. And they eventually, when the West computers closed, they were all dispersed throughout the lab, including Vaughan herself. And she retired from NASA, as did all of these women. Eventually, I think, if I remember one of the children's books I looked at, Mary Winston Jackson, moved from the science section to personnel to help mentor and move a lot of these incoming women, African-American women, into these positions, and being a major part of science and mathematics and our space program and our flight program. And this is important. I mean, these women did amazing work. But this book chronicles a lot. That's the reason I said I would not recommend it for the youngest women in middle school, and they have to be really, really good readers. They also have to be very invested in NASA history, space flight, women's history, even the civil rights movement, because that's what this book encapsulates. It encapsulates all of this. It focuses very much on the life and world going on at Langley Labs and the town outside it. And that includes these women's lives and their community, and how things grew and changed from being this kind of thrown together place around a military base in the 1930s to what it is today, which is one of the major NASA hubs where they do a lot of their science, and a huge community that grew up around it. So that's what this book covers. It's fantastic. It's a great resource. I mean, I would recommend it even to parents who are general parents or parents doing homeschooling stuff, and you want to cover this kind of area of history and incorporating science into it. It's a great resource to kind of get some ideas of what to look at for parents, and to kind of as a research source. And for the older kids, particularly the high school, later middle school, really good readers, it's a great book to read. I mean, it will take you a while. but there's a lot of information in it. And it goes over, some of the stuff I admit, it goes over my head. The school system was not nice to me, particularly when it comes to mathematics. So I ended up having a bunch of crappy teachers and being really bad at math, and getting a D in chemistry. So as well as, even though I love math and science, as you'll see throughout this channel, I'm a big STEM person. I was not really good at it in school. My husband was a physics minor. He's very, very good at math. He loves math. Statistics are a big thing of his. He's a baseball fan. He might understand more of this science than I would, but there's a lot of science, there's a lot of math in here, along with the social aspects and the history aspects of this book. So again, it's a great resource. Amazing stories about some amazing women. I'm interested in looking at some more of the children's books on there and introducing them to my daughter, because they're an important part of history. These women and their contributions to mathematics and aeronautics and the history of flight, not just space flight, but flight in general. I mean, Dr. Darden was doing stuff on sonic booms and doing computing. The other thing, this is the very beginning of computing, and you had these women learning computer languages, writing computer languages, working with these giant machines, and in some cases even double checking the math. So that's kind of a brief survey of this fantastic book. I covered the children's book, the author, along with the help from another children's book author, kind of summarized it in a children's picture book that I covered in a different review. I'm going to try to cover some more children's books on these individual women. I did a couple on Katherine Johnson already. I am going to cover the film because it's interesting and problematic, very problematic, but that's a different video. So again, this is a brief overview of a fantastic book. Again, recommended, probably no younger than 12, and that's still kind of stretching it. You know, parents, you know your kids best. You know how good their reading skill is. There's nothing outright dark in these books, so to speak. It does cover the civil rights movement. There is a little bit of death here because as I said, Johnson's first husband dies. I does not go into detail, but otherwise it's pretty clean in that sense. It focuses very much on the history and kind of the social lives of these women and how that affects their work and their life in growing around Langley Labs in Hampton, Virginia. So that's it for this review. This book does do chronological, so it bounces back and forth with the women quite a bit on what's going on. So it's going chronologically through history, not necessarily focusing on individual women at times. It does jump around quite a bit. But it's a great book, great resource, highly recommended for anybody interested in these areas of history or in general. But that is it for this review. If you like my review, I have quite a few other book reviews. I'm going to be doing more on African American history and science later on. Like I said, I'm going to cover the film as well. I also have some other education reviews and stuff like that. If you want to like and subscribe to my channel, you can get more access to that. And that is it. Thank you.